Can we get like a hands up all the people who've raised investments in the past? Maybe an angel round, maybe a proper VC round? Okay. So quite a few. So what we'll be doing here is we'll be going over the different aspects of the term sheet, the specific VC terms that all the promoters should be aware of, and how important it is to negotiate these properly. So a term sheet is a letter of intent. So a letter of intent essentially means that it's not a binding agreement. In case it breaks down, you can't take the other party to court. It's like a gentleman's handshake saying that I will put in the money and you will abide by it. So after the LOI, usually there's a more comprehensive document that has to be entered into to finalize the deal. Slide, whether it's binding or not. Now, this is the biggest question that all the startups face. And even if it's a non-binding term sheet, there are certain parts of the term sheet that can be binding. So I'll give you an example. The confidentiality provision, saying that you will not disclose the terms to a third party, that will be binding most of the time. There will be another provision like the exclusivity clause, that you are not going to go around shopping for other better deals based on the term sheet that you've gotten today. So you won't look for better deals. I'm sorry, do you have a question? Yeah. So if it has been breached, then they have a binding agreement for which they can take legal remedy against the party who's broken it. So it is as good as breaking a non-disclosure agreement. That one clause constitutes the non-disclosure agreement between the parties. So it's been breached. Depends on what action they want to take. They can take you to court. They can initiate arbitration if it has an arbitration provision and get the legal remedies that are available, which means injunctive relief, preventing you from further discussions, any monetary damages, stuff like that. But at times you might want a co-investment deal. And it's important that that does not clash, because your investor might also be fine with you looking for other co-investors in that deal. Maybe there are 3 or 4 investors and he's given you his amount and he's saying find other investors who are willing to invest on the same rights. Every part of the term sheet that is binding is a part that you have to be very wary of, because the other parts you'll negotiate along the way, but the binding parts you have to be really careful about. This is a very common issue that happens because larger investors always have competing businesses or similar businesses. So if you have an agri business, then you will always have 1 or 2 other portfolio entities in your portfolio which are at least doing something similar, which you might consider to be competing in a way. So at the end of it, essentially it comes down to your rapport with the investor and the confidence that he has in your business, because there is really no legal solution around it. I mean, you can have the clause in the agreement, but this is it doesn't matter because you have to sign the document. This might be the clause that might prevent the signing of the document, so it depends on how you negotiate it. Of course. In terms of, if you're talking specifically about your IP, which is of course a very valid point, in terms of IP, you can of course have certain safeguards in the document itself which explicitly state that the investors who are sitting on your board, who might have a board seat, who have access to all of your documentation, they cannot share it. So there's a confidentiality provision on them. Apart from that, they are not allowed to share it with even their staff unless it's on a need-to-know basis. Sorry? The need-to-know provision is again slightly broad. So maybe you can at maximum limit it to employees and say that your contractors are not allowed to get it, or senior employees. So for angels, for smaller angels, they might agree to it, smaller angels. But institutional investors, they tend to have very asymmetric documents at times, where they might not be willing to budge on things like non-compete, where they might say that as an investor, I'll invest wherever I want and I'll exit on the terms I want. And you are the party that is looking for money. So it's how you negotiate with them that matters. And in larger institutional investors, the wiggle room tends to be a little less. Example, you have a deal from X investors. Suddenly, because you have that deal, another 5 investors are interested. Somebody's found value in this transaction, in this startup. Maybe there's something to look into it. So they'll start you might get more interest because of that one deal. And that is, again, how most of the dynamics work. If you go around with a term sheet versus if you go around simply with an idea and a startup, then the interest will be slightly more if you are going around with the term sheet. That's why it's important that the exclusivity clause is drafted in such a manner that you're allowed to look for other investors in case of a co-investment deal. Because certain investors will say that I am enough, you cannot raise, unless you're raising a further round later down the line, you should be fine with just me being there on the table. So again, I can't speak about the commercial way of doing that because I'm a lawyer, but if you have a term sheet and you're allowed to go around and discuss it with other investors, then you can, of course, take your investor on board, tell them that you're speaking with other 4 investors who are these guys, as long as everybody is on the table, because they'll have to, it's not just about the term sheet, everybody will have to sign the investment document later on. And those tend to be large, copious documents, 30, 40 page long, 30, 40 page long documents on the lower side. Some of them are 100-page long. So that's why being completely honest and open with the investor from the very beginning is always the best step, because they will find out. It's a very small community. They will know if the startup is shopping around. From experience, and I am a lawyer, I can say that the lawyers of both sides tend to be a little more hyperactive. They want to ask for better rights. So if you have clear set of rights that both the parties had agreed to at the onset, then both the lawyers will stay in their limits. They will not take extra time in documentation, because they just have to state it in a better manner in the main agreements. So I'll just ask you a question. Do you think it's just the money that buys a person of experience, or is it the person's experience itself? If you determine that a lawyer that you've hired knows the venture capital industry, he might have worked at the larger firm before and has started his own business. There are a lot of lawyers like that who were partner at, say, the Amarchand Mangaldas and the AZBs of the world, and now they've started their own firm. So they do have the experience. They know how to negotiate these deals. So it's your job as the startup to find a lawyer who understands the business, who knows the VC industry. And then it's lawyer versus lawyer at the end of the day, because it's the commercial deals. You finalize the commercial deals in the term sheet. But the lawyer's job is to ensure that presented in the document. So there is no hanky-panky anywhere. The bigger firm's lawyer has not inserted some onerous clauses which you as the promoter, as the layman, is not able to identify properly. That is the job of the lawyer, because the commercials are already set in stone. They are just there to ensure that what was said in the term sheet is being represented in the investment document. So again, in terms of your main question, can you find a lawyer of that side? I definitely believe that. Before joining CIA, I was working at a law firm where both the partners had worked at Luthra and Amarchand Mangaldas before that. So in terms of corporate pedigree, you will always find lawyers who know their way around the industry. If you're taking a professional's help, then the terms of the help have to be very clear, because you don't want to be in the scenario where suddenly midway through the deal you're saying pro bono, and the lawyer's time period, the time that he has to spend on each document, the time he has to take out of negotiation, he could be spending it somewhere else. He could be making more money somewhere else. So it's better to have a clear commercial transaction rather than a free transaction where you're trying to get a freebie out of it. Not so much capability, I'd say more importantly, the person should be driven to look out for your interest. So it's a non-disclosure agreement. Again, maybe what you are speaking about is instances where either the investor has chosen not to initiate legal action because the cost is not enough, that he doesn't want to bear the cost of actually going after you. So they have to make that decision. But it comes down to the fact, do you as a startup want to be at the mercy of the investor where they say, okay, it's a small startup, I don't want to go after them, let them do whatever they want. But they will withdraw from the deal and you will be left with a term sheet which has no value. It is an integrity issue and it's also a legal issue, because again, the fact that it is binding, so I'll just try to explain it in a different way. If it were not binding and you went and did something, then there was no onus on you to not do that. Because it's a binding legal document where they've said you are not allowed to do this, and you go around it. The integrity issue comes from the fact that you were explicitly prohibited from doing that by virtue of the law. So rather than simply saying that we expect you not to do that, they made it a legal document. They've made it a legally binding clause. So that's a great point, because you can put that restriction. You can clearly include it, because again, this is a contractual right. You are signing on to it and he's signing on to it. So you can put all the restrictions that you want as long as they're clearly set out in the document. So you can have those two sets of reserved rights. For a revenue of lower than X amount, you can't hire. For a revenue of greater than X amount. In terms of board composition, nowadays the investors prefer not to have a director on the board. They prefer to have just an observer. So essentially, an observer is a non-voting board member who's going to sit at all of your meetings, who's going to see all of your happenings at the shareholder meeting and at the board meeting, and be aware of everything that is happening. So most of the times, the investors give the right of affirmative vote to the observer itself. So you don't have to go to the main institutional investor. You would rather just need to approach the observer, and he will give his go-ahead. He'll get his approval from up, and he'll just give it to you. Now, in terms of board composition, an interesting thing that happens is in startups which have more than one founder, maybe you have 3 or 4 founders at a point of time, the investor might actually raise a concern and say that I don't want all of your founders to be there on the board. I would just want maybe two or three of the two founders to be on the board, and the third guy is going to be mine. Or maybe I want two independent people, two independent advisors or independent industry luminaries to be there on the board of your company. So that's how the composition of the board can be determined, and that's heavily negotiated, because again the lesser number of directors that you have on the board, the lesser the power the startup has essentially in taking decisions, because then you are dependent on the independent advisor and on the promoter and on the investor for taking all decisions. So I'll tell you a clause that comes along with a director on the board with an investor. They will require you to take director's liability insurance along with that for that director. So the thought is just that maybe they don't want to get into the legal liability of having a director on the board in case a regulatory action is taken against the startup or anything like that, because the director is held liable for the actions of the company. So they will, if they do take a director on board, they will have strict provisions stating that he is not one of the promoters, he is not involved in day-to-day operations. You will have to take insurance only for him specifically of a quantum that the investor determines. So in some ways, it's actually better not to have a director on the board as well. This non-compete provision has been discussed quite a lot earlier. So it's important that the non-compete provision is properly drafted, and the definition of business and competing business is explicitly put, because from a promoter's perspective, you've put in your sweat and blood into the company, and you don't want to be in a position where for some reason your employment with the company is terminated. Yes, you continue to hold some shares, but you are no longer employed by the company. You're no longer a promoter on the board of the company because of X reasons, and you are prevented from looking for further opportunities in the same sector. Say you're in the fintech sector. You don't want a non-compete that prevents you from looking for work in the fintech sector altogether. So it's important that this is properly drafted so that the investors' concerns are covered, but it's not so broad as to prevent the founders from looking for employment. There are competing views on the fact whether it is enforceable or not enforceable, because at times non-compete provisions have been held enforceable by the court of law as well. But the main ground is that they have to be reasonable. The restrictions that are imposed on your ability to look for employment have to be reasonable. So if it is drafted in a manner that they are completely reasonable, I don't see any reason why they would not be enforceable in a court of law. So now we're coming to the most legal rights that are there in the agreement, the reps, warranties, and the indemnity. So in the investment process, because the investor is coming on at a later stage in the company, he has no idea how you had managed your business before he came on board. So he's going to take a certain number of representations and warranties from you. So the reps are essentially you acknowledging that as on today, I have paid all of my taxes, all of my IP is owned by me, it's not owned by some third party that is licensing it to me, or even if that is the case, it is to be stated in that. I am in compliance with all regulatory requirements, and my assets are owned by me, none of them are licensed to somebody else. So essentially, these are reps relating to your assets, your tax returns, if they've been paid on time, and regarding all of the exact state of the company. So the reps come into the reps link with the indemnity clause essentially, because the indemnity gets triggered in case there is a breach of the rep. So it's very important at the stage of the investment. This is not going to come in the term sheet per se, it's going to come at the stage of the investment document. But the reps are going to be determined based on the DD that they do on the company. So sometimes in case the DD is very, very limited, where they don't have time to do a due diligence, they're happy with the investment team, they'll just make you sign on to the reps and warranties where you're saying that yes, everything is in order, and they'll put the money inside in the company. But if they do a comprehensive DD, then they'll understand that certain things are not in order, so they will put those into the reps. For instance, if certain service tax dues have not been paid, then they will explicitly state that prior to the investments, X, Y, and Z service tax dues will be paid by the founder. Now, how they become relevant is in the indemnity clause, because the indemnity clause is essentially a explicit clause saying, in case a regulator comes after me as the investor, in case a third party comes after me as the investor who is claiming that the company has breached his IP, anybody of that sort, because of a breach of the reps, then the promoters and the company are going to make good the losses. So any amount that I had to expend for doing a analysis of the claim and for finalizing and fixing the claim and for paying the dues will have to be made good by the promoter. And this is the clause that I think all the promoters should be wary of, and they should negotiate and put a cap on this clause as well. Because you don't want an unlimited indemnity obligation on the company or on the promoters. So putting the cap and what the right cap is, again, based on the discussion that you will have with the investor. But it's very important that you do have a cap. If they do a DD on the company and they realize that the IP is not owned by the company that they're putting their money into, but it's owned by the founders, then they will require you as a precondition to the investment to transfer all IP from the founders to the company. So that asset transfer will also be there as a requirement for the deal. And once it's there, then it's not a breach of the rep. So the investor will always prefer to have IP in the entity that he's putting money into. He's not putting money into the individuals, but in the company. So in more sophisticated investment deals, the promoters will also be required to sign an employment agreement, where they are essentially employees of the company, and all IP that is generated during the course of their employment will be will be owned by the company itself. So that will be captured at that level. You have represented to the investor that I own all of the IP that is integral for doing business. I meaning the company owns all the IP that is integral for doing the business. And it is not infringing the IP of any third party. Now suddenly one day another company comes along and sues you for infringing its intellectual property. So either its patents, its trademarks, or anything of that sort. And as part of the suit, they also name the investor as a party, saying that, Acha, you've put in the money into the company, and they put the investor as a party to the suit. Then the investor can say, I had to spend money, hire a lawyer who would analyze if this is a valid claim. I had to settle the dispute. I had to take whatever action was required. For all of that action, you will have to make good the loss. So the indemnity is essentially slightly different from damages, because in damages, you need to have reasonable foreseeable damages. And indemnity is an agreement that whatever the losses are, I agree to make good those losses. So that's why it's very important that it is set properly. The interesting thing about the indemnity clause is that it doesn't require an actual damage to have happened to the investor. If there is an apprehension of damage, or if he had to spend money on a lawyer to just analyze if there could have been damage, he can require you to pay the indemnity for that as well. It can be for direct and indirect losses. So it can be as wide as the drafters want it and as narrow as they want it. So that's why it's very important that it's read and analyzed properly. Indemnity is a contract essentially between two parties, saying that for any loss which I am putting in the contract, you will make good that loss. So that's why it's not a specific VC term, it's a general contractual obligation. So they can structure it in any manner they want. And that the investor might claim a loss being the expense he had to spend on hiring a lawyer to see if he might bear any losses from a regulatory action. For instance, if the income tax department comes after the company, the investor is again spooked by the fact that, oh, there's an income tax department investigation. He'll hire a lawyer. He might claim that damage from you. Because an indemnity is not a damage, it is a contract to make good any losses or expenses. So you are agreeing to pay the amount on the happening of a certain event. So setting the event and setting the amount that you will pay is very important here. These are all possible, but would the investor allow it? That's the main question. Because if he's investing in one company, he would want to consolidate all IP in the company that he's putting his money into. So technically, everything can be done. All the structuring can be done. But the investor, in most cases, would want the integral IP to be held in the entity where he's putting the money, because that's the company with the value in it. He would want all promoters and all the other entities to just transfer all the IP to the main entity which is receiving the money. No, but in terms of the employment agreement, you will have a provision. Let's say you're working for an MNC. It's similar to that. You're working for an MNC and you are writing a novel at the same time you're working on a particular software. So it can be argued that the novel is in your free time, it's not related to the business, you're not working on the novel during your working hours, and no one is going to really claim it as part of their business. So the similar logic is applicable here as well. If you're working on a novel while you're free on Saturdays, that might not become part of the entity. It has to be related to the business. It has to be part of your normal obligations as the founder of the company. And that's how you have to structure it in the employment agreement as well. So again, the employment agreement becomes another document that has to be read and negotiated in conjunction. Yeah. Vesting is essentially a mechanism by which you have, being owners of your shares, the investor is investing in the company. So he wants you to earn the shares over the period that you are with the company. So your shares, a portion of that share is going to be vested with you over the period of 5 or 6 years that he is there with the company. So this is a pretty important clause because the vesting is going to be directly linked with your employment with the company. Because in case you cease to be an employee, the investor might require that all the unvested shares have to be obligatorily transferred to either the ESOP fund or to the ESOP pool or to a third party that is appointed by the company. They might even require that you transfer it to the investor. So that's why it's very important that this vesting provision be properly drafted. So vesting, I'll give you an example. You have 50% of your shares in the company. Now the investor says that I am coming in today. Over the next 5 years, you have to earn those shares through a vesting process. So notionally speaking, the shares that you own are going to be vested with you over a period of 5 years. So each year you're going to get, say, 5 years, so you're going to get 1/5 of your shares vested with you. So on the second or third year, it's transferred to either to an ESOP pool or to the investor, or however it is structured. Because the thought process is that you have not earned those shares. And that's the consequence of vesting that has to be negotiated. The tag-along right and drag-along right are really what is most important to the promoter, because the tag-along right will require that in case you are selling your shares to any third party, the investor has the right to also sell his shares in priority to the founders. So if you're selling it to, say, X person, the investors will require that you sell 40% of my shares along with it as well, and you cannot sell before I am selling. So how the tag-along clause is actually negotiated is that you can either have a full tag, meaning that if the promoters are selling more than 50% or more than 60% of the shares, the investors might get spooked in the project. They might say that, okay, you are trying to leave the company. So you will leave, I'm sorry, I think we'll have to finish the session. Okay, sure. So in terms of the exit, in terms of tag-along, you might be required to sell all of your shares. The drag-along is slightly different because in the drag-along, you are required to, in case of the happening of the drag, the investor finds a purchaser for the shares, and he might require all the other shareholders to sell their shares along with you. I think we'll just take all the specific questions just outside. I mean, we're around, so anybody who has a specific questions regarding any of these rights can just approach us. Because I think the next session is just about to start right now. So, yeah. Thank you everybody for your time. I hope this was an informative session. And yeah. So we'll be around. If in case anybody has any queries, please feel free to approach us.